Good afternoon. I'm Martin Garner, Director of the Amherst College Library, and on behalf of the Emily Dickinson Museum and the Harvard University Press, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Emily Dickinson's Literary Legacy, unveiling the new definitive edition of her correspondence. If you're not here for that program, this is your chance to go. Here's what to expect. After this introduction, I'll give the floor to our featured speaker to share some of her work, and then she and Brooke Steinhauser, Senior Director of Programs at the Emily Dickinson Museum, will have a conversation about the book. We'll then open it up to questions from the audience, including from our guests joining us on Zoom, who will be asked to submit their questions using the Q&A feature. After the Q&A is over, we invite you to stay for informal conversation and refreshments. You can also purchase a copy of the book from our partners at Amherst Books and get it signed by our featured guest. I would also invite you to take a look at the exhibit cases in the library's lobby, where we have a selection of letters in Emily's own hand from the library's collection, as well as earlier publications featuring her letters. For our guests joining us on Zoom, you can see all of the letters we have in the library on our Amherst College Digital Collections platform, the link for which is being shared in the chat. I would also invite you to read 2 open access books on Emily Dickinson published by Amherst College Press. Again, links are coming in the chat. I think I sent that email. If not, they'll be coming soon. And our in-person guests can look at hard copies of those titles in the back of the room. We do have a couple chairs up front here. If you want to, we'll just wait quietly as you join us, so it's awkward for all of us. No, we're so glad you could make it. And now I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Cristanne Miller is the SUNY Distinguished Professor and Edward H. Butler Professor of English at the University of Buffalo SUNY. She has published broadly on 19th and 20th century poetry. Her books on Dickinson include Emily Dickinson, A Poet's Grammar, Reading in Time, Emily Dickinson in the 19th Century, the edition Emily Dickinson's Poems, As She Preserved Them, winner of the MLA Best Scholarly Edition Prize, and now also the Letters of Emily Dickinson, co-edited with Donald Mitchell, published just this year. In addition to her extensive publications on modernist poetry, Chris is founder and director of the Marianne Moore Digital Archive. She often says that Emily Dickinson has been her ticket to travel the world. She's lectured or presented at conferences on Dickinson across North America and Europe, and in China, Japan, and Taiwan. While working on the edition of the poems, As She Preserved Them, she held a Tocqueville Distinguished Chair Fulbright Fellowship in Paris. She has also held several national and international fellowships, and in 2017 received the University of Buffalo's President's Medal for Excellence in Scholarship and Service. Please welcome Professor Miller.
Donald and I'm so sorry Donald can't be here. He is absolutely crucial to every stage of this venture. And in fact, this was his idea to start with. And he had to plead with me to enter in eventually on the work that he had already been working on, been doing for years. So Donald, you are here in you're present in your absence. Thank you to everyone. Donald and I have also often joked, took more than a village to put this edition together. It took some kind of megapolis. So thank you to the Amherst College Frost Library. Martin, thank you for that lovely introduction, especially the special collections librarians, Mike Kelly and Margaret Dakin, above all. Thank you to the Dickinson Museum for all of their work, Jane Wald and Brooke Steinhauser, again, among many others. What a joy to look out into this audience and see some faces of people I've known for a long time, and then a lot of, I hope, new friends. What I'm going to do is read from excerpts from several of Dickinson's letters, just to give you a sense of the registers in which she writes. And because I don't know if all of you will have her biography memorized, I will give you some background information about her life as we go along. So in 1885, Emily Dickinson wrote to 2 acquaintances that a letter is a joy of earth. It is denied the gods. She sent it once in 2 lines as a poem and once written out as prose. To her beloved Norcross cousins, Louisa and Frances, she wrote, What is it that instructs a hand lightly created to impel shapes to eyes at a distance, which for them have the whole area of life or death? Yet not a pencil in the street, but has this awful power, though nobody arrests it. An earnest letter is, or should be, life warrant or death warrant. For what is each instant but a gun? Harmless because unloaded, but that touched goes off. About 10 years earlier, she also used the word power about letters when writing to Thomas Wentworth Higginson. A letter always feels to me like immortality because it is the mind alone, without corporeal friend. Indebted in our talk to attitude and accent, there seems a spectral power in thought that walks alone. In Dickinson's letters, this power takes forms that are humorous, profound, ironic, consolatory. Dickinson's first extant letter is written to her brother Austin in 1842. Austin was 12, Emily was 11. This letter has the breathlessness and complete lack of punctuation one might expect from a very articulate and witty child. My dear brother, as father was going to Northampton and thought of coming over to see you, I thought I would improve the opportunity and write you a few lines. We miss you very much. Indeed, you cannot think how odd it seems without you. There was always such a hurrah wherever you was. I miss my bedfellow very much, for it is rare that I can get any now, for Aunt Elizabeth is afraid to sleep alone, and Vinny has to sleep with her, but I have the privilege of looking under the bed every night, which I improve, as you may suppose. That goes on. To her girlfriends, Dickinson writes more about herself personally. In this 1845 letter to her friend Abia Root, 14-year-old Dickinson anticipates her romantic conquests. How do you enjoy your school this term? Are the teachers as pleasant as our old school teachers? I expect you have a great many prim, starched up young ladies there who I doubt not are perfect models of propriety and good behavior. If they are, don't let your free spirit be chained by them. I am growing handsome very fast indeed. I expect I shall be the belle of Amherst when I reach my 17th year. I don't doubt I shall have perfect crowds of admirers at that age. In September of 1847, Dickinson began her year at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, a school she loved despite occasional homesickness. The courses were demanding, but she enjoyed the challenge and wrote descriptively to Abia and wittily to her brother about her time and the conditions there. In October, she wrote to Austin about the lack of political news. Has the Mexican War terminated yet? And how? Are we beat? Do you know of any nation about to besiege South Hadley? If so, do inform me of it, for I would be glad of a chance to escape if we are to be stormed. I suppose Miss Lyon, the preceptress, would furnish us all with daggers and order us to fight for our lives in case such peril should befall us. Among Dickinson's papers found after her death were several writing notes and some apparently unsent letters. One was written on very fine diminutive stationery around early 1850. It's folded as though to send and bears the imprint of an oval as though it had enclosed something. The entire note reads, "With the sincere spite of a woman." Woman is capitalized and underlined. We have no idea who the addressee might be, but we place this note immediately following a long, earnest letter to Jane Humphrey, in which she sympathizes over Jane's father's death and writes at length about the religious revival in Amherst. Christ is calling everyone here. All my companions have answered, even my darling Vinny. This is her sister Lavinia. Even my darling Vinny believes she loves and trusts him, and I am standing alone in rebellion and growing very careless. Abby, Mary, Jane, and farthest of all, my Vinny have been seeking, and they all believe they have found. But she writes, has dared to do strange things, bold things. I have heeded beautiful tempters, yet do not think I am wrong. Then at the end of the letter, she comments that our theologian, this is a mutual friend, James Kimball, must have made way with himself. I really don't care if he has. I prayed for pride. I have received yet more indifference, and he may go where he listeth. This note of sincere spite from a woman, we think, makes a nice juxtaposition to the longer, chattier letter to her friend Jane, and points to her really quite considerable correspondence in the early years, but with and about young men. Dickinson writes frequently about religion in these growing up years, with concern, but rarely with anxiety, and she reiterates her preference of danger over the safety of professed Christian belief. Again, to Obaya, she writes, "The shore is safer, Obaya, but I love to buffet the seas. I can count the bitter wrecks here in these pleasant waters and hear the murmuring winds, but oh, I love the danger. You are learning control and firmness. Christ Jesus will love you more." In 1851, she writes her first letter to her passionately beloved friend, Susan Gilbert. Although she also writes Susan about faith, in February 1852, she takes up a different topic. "Vinny and I have been talking about growing old today. Vinny thinks that 20 must be a fearful position for one to occupy. Dickinson has just turned 21. I tell her I don't care if I am young or not. Had his leaf be 30. And you, as most anything else." Vinny expresses her sympathy at my sere and yellow leaf. "Oh, my darling one, how long you wander from me, how weary I grow of waiting and looking and calling for you. Sometimes I shut my eyes and shut my heart towards you and try hard to forget you because you grieve me so, but you'll never go away. Oh, you never will. Say, Susie, promise me again, and I will smile faintly and take up my little cross again of sad, sad separation." Susan was teaching at a school in Baltimore for a year, and consequently, Emily was writing her many letters. Austin and Susan announced their engagement in 1853, that's a year later, and married in 1856. During the American Civil War, Dickinson writes many of her most profound poems about death, pain, and grief. While few letters deal at length with the war, several do mention it. And among her longest letters on the war is this one to the Norcross sisters about the death of one of Austin's friends, Fraser Stearns. "'Tis least that I can do to tell you of brave Fraser, killed at Newbern, darlings, his big sharp heart shot away by a Minnie ball. I had read of those. I didn't think Fraser would carry one to Eden with him. Just as he fell in his soldier's cap with his sword at his side, Fraser rode through Amherst, classmates to the right of him and classmates to the left of him to guard his narrow face. He fell by the side of Professor Clark, his superior officer, lived 10 minutes in a soldier's arm, asked twice for water, murmured just, 'My God,' and passed. Austin is stunned completely. Let us love better, children. It's most that's left to do." So I'm sure many of you caught the allusion to Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade, right? Cannon to the left of them, cannon to the right of them. A few months later, Dickinson writes these same cousins, "Sorrow seems more general than it did, and not the estate of a few persons since the war began." And she concludes again with a kind of inspiration. "Every day life feels mightier, and what we have the power to be, more stupendous." Many of Dickinson's most intimate letters are to Lou and Fanny, and this is one that's particularly appropriate at this moment where it doesn't know whether to rain or snow in Amherst. "Spring is a happiness so beautiful, so unique, so unexpected that I don't know what to do with my heart. Life is a spell so exquisite that everything conspires to break it." In the 1860s, Dickinson also began her correspondence with Thomas Higginson, a minister turned critic, poet, abolitionist, supporter of women's rights, and a colonel in the Civil War who led the first federally recognized regiment of African-American troops. Initially, she was deferential toward him, but this correspondence quickly became an exchange among equals, even though she continued to sign herself your scholar. Higginson visited Dickinson here in Amherst in 1870 and repeatedly invited Dickinson to come to Boston to see him, which she never did. In 1881, she writes, "We dwell as when you saw us. The mighty dying of my father made no external change. Mother and sister are with me, and my brother and pseudo-sister in the nearest house. When father lived, I remained with him because he would miss me. Now mother is helpless. A holier demand. I do not go away, but the grounds are ample, almost travel to me. And the few that I knew came since my father died. It is solemn to remember that vastness is but the shadow of the brain which casts it." Throughout the late 1870s and 1880s, Dickinson was dealing with death and illness. Her mother had a stroke in 1875 and was bedridden until her death in 1882. Her father had died in 1874, and 6 family members or close friends died between 1882 and 1885. Particularly bruising was the 1883 death of her 8-year-old nephew, Gilbert. Dickinson sat at his deathbed and then was alarmingly ill, as she put it, for weeks. In a poem, she writes, "Each that we lose takes part of us." In 1869, she wrote her cousin, Perez Cohen, "Dying is a wild night and a new road." During her last decade of life, Dickinson wrote moving and highly lyrical letters about dying, but also of fortitude, compassion, humor, and love. To Susan, after Gilbert's death, Dickinson writes, "The vision of immortal life has been fulfilled. How simply at the last the fathom comes. Gilbert rejoiced in secrets. His life was panting with him. With what menace of light he cried, 'Don't tell, Aunt Emily.' Now my ascended playmate must instruct me. Show us, prattling preceptor, but the way to thee. Pass to thy rendezvous of light, pangless except for us who slowly ford the mystery which thou hast leaped across." Some weeks later, she writes to Susan, "The first section of darkness is the densest, dear. After that, light trembles in. You asked, would I remain? Irrevocably. I know no other way." And in one of the hundreds of Donald Mitchell's and my decisions about how to position letters in appropriate sequence, we placed a vaguely dated note to Sarah Jenkins among Dickinson's responses to Gilbert's death. Joseph Jenkins was the minister at Gilbert's funeral. The entire note to Sarah reads, "Area, no test of depth." Dickinson's late letters also include among her most erotic love letters. In 1880, she writes to Otis Lord, "To lie so near your longing, to touch it as I passed, for I am but a restive sleeper and often should journey from your arms through the happy night. But you will lift me back, won't you? For only there I ask to be. I say, if I felt the longing nearer than in our dear past, perhaps I could not resist to bless it, but must because it would be right. The style is God's, my sweet one. For your great sake, not mine, I will not let you cross, but it is all yours. And when it is right, I will lift the bars and lay you in the moss." Oh. "It is anguish," she continues, "I long conceal from you to let you leave me hungry, but you ask the divine crust, and that would doom the bread." Dickinson also writes with deep intimacy to some of her friends, such as Sarah Tuckerman, a neighbor she had visited and corresponded with since 1855. In 1880, she sends Sarah a letter poem on love. In 1882, she sends her the poem Sweet Pirate of the Heart. A letter in 1885 reads, "We want you to wake. Easter has come and gone. Morning without you is a dwindled dawn, quickened toward all celestial things by crows I heard this morning, except a loving caw from a nameless friend." She would hardly need to sign her name for Sarah to know who had written this letter. We also think this note indicates that Dickinson did see Tuckerman on occasional mornings. In 1877, Austen was recovering from a bad case of malaria, and Lavinia had just recovered from an illness. Dickinson sends Austen a poem, a letter poem, that exists only in this copy. The fact that Earth is heaven, whether heaven is heaven or not, if not an affidavit of that specific spot, not only must confirm us that it is not for us, but that it would affront us to dwell in such a place. For Dickinson, and at least many of her moods, Earth is heaven, and a letter, like friendship and love, is a joy of earth. So now I get to talk to Brooke, and then I'd be very happy to take your questions.
Goodness. Can you hear me?
Check, check.
Hello. Oh, thank you so much, Chris. What a joy of earth you have given us today to read these letters to us and to be here with us. Congratulations on this incredible accomplishment. This volume represents just a huge, new, exciting, shimmering resource for those of us who live with every day with Emily Dickinson, and for those who are yet to discover her. They will find her here in these incredible letters. I would love to just give you a chance to tell us more about your editorial process. But before we launch into that, maybe you can help us understand why now was the right time for this volume.
I would say any time in the last 30 years would have been the right time for this volume. So the last edition of Dickinson's letters came out in 1958. It is now hopelessly out of date in almost every way. And more and more letters had been discovered but not collected. Scholarship using the letters was also often out of date because scholars would go to Johnson's letters and not look in the 50 other publications, each citing one discovered letter or a few discovered letters to see what else had come out since Johnson's publication. So Donnell, oh gosh, probably in about 2005, maybe 2010, started doing research on the letters and in particular working on redating. He started working on redating letters. And he then persuaded me by about 2015 to join him in the endeavor. And then we worked together from then on. But yes, we just felt with every passing year that it was more important that a new edition of the letters appear.
How does one even approach such a monumental task?
Well, we couldn't have done it without the librarians here at the Frost and at the Houghton and at Yale and Princeton and everywhere else. So librarians are our very best friends. Yeah, we spent a lot of, we looked at every letter in manuscript, or if there wasn't an extant manuscript, we went back to the original transcript, or as close as we could get to an original transcription of the letters. So that's the first step. Redating, we were doing continuously a lot of biographical work on people mentioned in the letters that aren't, explored, explained, described by Johnson. And then a huge amount of work on figuring out appropriate sequences for letters because Dickinson didn't date most of her letters, and many of the letters could not be dated by more than, let's say, a year in a season. But when you're putting together a collection of letters, you have to decide, let's say within spring of 1872, what comes first, and then next, and then next. So what's the story that you're telling? What's the narrative? And how does that work in the volume as a whole and for each individual correspondent and so on? So anyway, it was just one step after the other. And fortunately, we did not know at the beginning how many steps there would be.
So this edition, it's the first collected letter since 1958. It includes 1,304 letters. It includes more recently discovered manuscripts of letters and 200 letter poems, letters published after 1958. So for those of us out there scratching our heads, how is it possible that we could still be discovering letters?
It's another joy of earth. The people wrote to us. For example, one just very happy circumstance is that Colin Murphy wrote us to say that on the walls of the Atlantic Monthly office for, as far as he knew, decades, maybe a century, there had been hanging a framed Dickinson poem. Did we know about it? And it's signed Emily. That is to say, it was probably sent as a letter poem to somebody in that office who then framed it and put it up on the wall. And he found it in an old box. So, wow, will you take it out of the frame? Let us really, look at it. And he did. And so, that's serendipity. People began discovering more letters almost immediately following Johnson's edition, Johnson and Ward's edition. So, for example, the Lyman letters published by Richard Sewell came out in 1960, very early in the 1960s. So this is a process that's been going on. It's just that nobody has been collecting them. Polly Longsworth, who I think is not here, has discovered letters that were not known about and published short pieces about them, either in the Dickinson Journal or the Amherst College Library Newsletter and other places. But you really, just need to be scratching the earth all the time to come up with all the things that have been found and published. Auction catalogs, right? So a lot of the letters have wandered into private hands, and consequently we were not able to see them, but we were able to find auction catalogs that had published digital versions of, images of them online, so that we could work from the digital copy. Anyway, just a lot of detective work.
Can you imagine discovering an Emily Dickinson letter hanging on the wall of the Atlantic Monthly? This is a decidedly 21st century editorial approach in this book. I wonder if you could tell us more about some of the decisions that you needed to make to do that.
Most of the decisions that markedly distinguish our volume from the 1958 in terms of what a 21st century approach would be have to do with annotation. So in Johnson's letter volume, if you are looking at a letter to Mrs. Holland, that's who she is, or Mrs. Josiah Holland. There are letters to Mrs. Henry Hills. Do these women have first names? Don't ask Thomas Johnson. So all women are given names. We put a lot of effort into attempting to identify as fully as possible all the day laborers that Dickinson mentions in various letters, and the shopkeepers in Amherst, glove makers, dressmakers. So there are at least 3 or 4 dressmakers who come to the house to work with Emily, Lavinia, and their mother over the decades. And they are mentioned by Dickinson only with their first name. So, trying to figure out who they were, first and last name, who they might be related to, what their position might be in Amherst. So that was also, we weren't always successful, but we put a lot of energy into attempting to identify the whole range of her acquaintance and not just the professional men, which was Thomas Johnson's focus. And then the final thing that I want to say is that we decided that it would be important in talking about the people who were her acquaintances in the town of Amherst, shopkeepers, laborers, again, to identify their race and ethnicity, so that we all as readers have a sense of the diversity of the population that she interacted with on a regular basis.
Again, just making this the most tremendous resource for those of us who are exploring her life further. Let's see, Dickinson letters occasionally contain erasures and omissions. So this is, I'm sure there's a lot you could say about this, Chris. I would love to just hear more about your process for achieving the most authentic transcription possible.
I want to say one more thing about that last question, which is to say we are hugely indebted to scholarship for a lot of the information that we pulled together about laborers, townspeople, and so on. And among other things that I'd like to point out is the fact that Karen Sanchez-Epler has given her students all kinds of assignments that came up with glorious information about Dickinson in Amherst and at Amherst College that we have found very useful. Anyway, so yes, erasures. Many of the letters that Dickinson wrote to her brother Austin in the early 1850s, and also a few later letters, are written in pencil, and they contain erasures. And all of the, as far as we can tell, all of the erasures have to do with Susan. Sometimes you can read Susan or Sue or Susie as the erased word. Sometimes you can tell that the ER of her is erased and then IM is written over the top of it, or that S is erased so that she becomes he, and so on and so on. Sometimes there are several lines erased. So it's impossible to say what those erasures contain. We can maybe make out a few words, but pencil erasures are extremely difficult to recover, far harder than ink erasures. And so, I've talked with Mike Kelly here in the library and with others, and we've done everything that we can, except going to huge expense and purchasing, I don't know, $10,000 worth of equipment. And even that we're not sure would accurately recover those erasures. So the erasures are just what they are. And we have represented missing text that's been erased as missing text, and we only say that something is a recovered erasure if we really could read the word, and we let you know what was erased and what we could read, which Johnson doesn't do. So in some of those letters, he'll say in a note there were erasures, but you can't tell what was erased. And I think it's interesting, to know what was actually being erased. Omissions is even more interesting. So Mabel Loomis Todd was, for the most part, an extraordinarily faithful transcriber of letters and poems. And so we can compare her work with others. She's really excellent, very attentive, very careful. However, when you look at her 1894 printer copy, you can see that within the printer copy are transcripts actually made by Frances Norcross. The Norcross sisters decided that they would not turn their letters over to Todd to transcribe, but they would send her transcriptions. The printer copy uses only recto pages. So Frances would write on both sides of a page. Todd would cross out the verso side and then retranscribe it as a verso side. So we could see Frances's transcription, Todd's, Mabel Loomis Todd's transcription. What we could also see in that 1894 printer copy at Yale are places where Todd edits both Frances Norcross's transcription and her own transcription to take out material. She crosses out transcribed material and then puts in ellipses. So there's material in these letters that hasn't been printed as part of the letters ever. Right? And sometimes it's just a few words. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 sentences. Some of the material seems totally innocuous. Why would she take that out? But I'll tell you, when I discovered this at Yale, I almost danced around that reading room. I was so thrilled because who would have thought? Right? And then I started going back through the earlier pages of the 1894 printer copy and realized that she had done this with other transcriptions as well. So in some of the letters to Elizabeth Holland, Todd has the transcription and crosses out some of the material and adds ellipses. Richard Sewell very influentially claimed that all of those ellipses in the Norcross letters were Frances's. Not true. As far as I know, Frances Norcross did not use ellipses. She claims that she didn't transcribe everything in the letters, but she didn't indicate where she was leaving material out. Todd, faithful as she was in her own way, showed you where she was omitting material, but didn't claim the omissions for herself. Anyway, so the omissions are just incredibly interesting. And there are other stories about omissions, but that's my favorite.
So dancing around the archives, speaking of archives, dating Dickinson letters is notoriously difficult and tricky. And I would love to hear you talk more about that, but also the role of the archive in your dating.
Okay, so first, Mimi Dakin, Margaret Dakin, I don't know if she's here, but she probably knows more about Dickinson's letters than any human being alive. And she was enormously helpful to us in threading our way through material in this archive, this special collections to help us date letters. So Donald did most of the dating, and these are the sources that he went to. First, Professor Snell here at Amherst College took weather readings twice a day, in the morning and the evening. These readings were not available to Johnson and Ward in 1958, but they make it possible if Dickinson says, heavy snowstorm, sorry, I can't come to visit you, we can actually look and see, okay, during February and March, when was there a really heavy snowstorm? That is just, it's golden. So that helped us with a lot of dating. We also looked at Austen's and Lavinia's diaries. Lavinia's diaries are especially helpful because she talks a lot about who's visiting whom on what days around town. Austen's diaries are helpful because of his travel to see family friends or their travel to see him. Dickinson often sent a letter with, let's say, Austen when he was going to visit Samuel Bowles rather than mailing it, right? So if she knew that Austen was about to visit, she would write a letter and send it with him. Or if Bowles was visiting next door at the Evergreens, she would send it across the lawn. So, who was visiting where is important in relation to dating information. We are always attentive to Dickinson's handwriting, which changes a lot from the very early years to her very late years, but we never date anything exclusively on the basis of handwriting. There are just so many other factors we feel need to come into play and can be brought into play. Patterns of bloom, right? When does an arbutus bloom in Amherst? When do the robins return? When are the bees most active? And so on and so on. So we did a lot with natural phenomenon.
So there are, among these 1,304 letters in here, there are letter poems. So why are letter poems important when we think about Dickinson? Sorry, why are letters and letter poems important when we think about Dickinson as a writer?
Well, the letters, I'm just going to let you decide for yourselves. I think the letters are priceless because they tell us about her life in a way that the poems don't. On the other hand, what we learn from her circulation of poems is that she thought of poems in many ways as a kind of communication, right? She wanted to send them to people, and she often sent the same poem to several people, 5, 6 people. But we also believe that Dickinson sent poems to people in a way that was occasional, right? So it's your birthday, your husband just died, a child who died, or some other event to celebrate, whatever it might be, would occasion a poem or lines from a poem. So, for example, that absolutely exquisite quatrain that Dickinson writes to Susan after the death of her nephew Gilbert. She sends exactly the same quatrain to Higginson a couple years later about the death of, I think it's Helen Hunt Jackson. So, these, for her, a poem, when it appears in a letter, is an act of communication. And I think that is extremely interesting. So adding back in 200 plus letter poems gives you both a much fuller sense of how she's communicating with people and how often she's communicating with people. There are some people represented in the letters volume for whom, for whom the only extant communication is letter poems. So if we left out the letter poems, you wouldn't know she was writing to Gertrude Vanderbilt. So it gives us a lot of information we didn't have before, and it helps us to see how closely intertwined in many ways the letters and the poems are. This is a woman who loved language. I mean, she just lived in language, and you hear it in the letters and you hear it in the poems.
Dickinson's language is extraordinary. Her letters are also extraordinary in that they are so rich with allusion to classic literature, contemporary literature, the Bible. So, you might receive a letter poem. You also might just receive a really dense letter from Emily Dickinson. What do you think it was like to be on the receiving end of a letter from Emily Dickinson?
Well, those of you who plan to read our introduction will see that it ends with our quoting one of Dickinson's neighbors who wrote in her diary, "Got a letter today from Emily Dickinson," with 5 exclamation marks after that. So we think that people were, thrilled to get these letters. We also think that Dickinson expected her correspondents to recognize her literary and political and news allusions, so that and she was reading contemporary literature as it was coming out. So Dickens, Robert Browning, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Longfellow, Tennyson. She was reading these things, and many less famous writers. She was reading them. She was quoting them. In some cases, there were kind of private phrases. So David Copperfield seems to have been a book that she and Austen and Lavinia all read and enjoyed, and they borrow phrases that they use with each other. Pretty comfortable. I think we're pretty comfortable, and so on. Anyway, so we point these out briefly when we can, not by explaining what we think they mean. We try to keep our annotation very lean, very factual, but just by pointing to the allusions. We think that Dickinson was kind of a language magpie. She read something, there was a phrase that she liked or a word that was unusual, and the next thing you know, she's using it in a letter or maybe even in a poem. And so one of the things that Donald was just brilliant at doing is looking through databases of historical newspapers and journals that Dickinson would most likely either have read or have had some knowledge of, and saying, oh my gosh, at the commencement ceremony at Williams College, somebody referred to a megatherium, I'm getting the word wrong, which is a giant sloth. And so, she writes a little letter previously undated about a megatherium on her strawberry. And and we think it's likely that that letter closely followed a report of that commencement speaker in one of the Amherst papers. So we were doing that kind of dating as well. She just loved, capturing things and then reusing them. And or for example, there's a wonderful letter that she writes to, I think it's the first one is to Elizabeth Holland about a storm and how it, is blowing up her apron strings. And it's a really delightful, highly metaphorical description. And then she uses it a day or two later in another letter to somebody else, word for word, right? And so, she wants to share things that she likes.
And she's workshopping a little bit too, maybe.
Workshopping, yes.
I have just maybe two more questions for you, Chris. And I also want to remind our audience that you're going to have a chance to ask Chris some questions. Both those of you who are here in person and those of you who are at home. If you're at home, pop your question in the Q&A and we'll try to get to it. So Chris, you have spent so much time with this incredible body of work. What are some of the patterns that begin to emerge for you when you're spending time with them?
In a way, that's a question that I would sort of rather turn over to, future readers and scholars. Tell me what the patterns are. I am so deeply immersed in the detail that it's a little bit hard for me to, get the overview. But there are a few things that are obvious, and I kind of mentioned them earlier. So a lot of the letters when she's a teenager or in her early 20s have to do with religion in some form. And there were constant revivals in Amherst and Western Massachusetts. As she said, she complained in that one letter, all of her friends are declaring themselves, members of the church. So religion is a frequent theme in the early letters. She writes a lot about her social life. We went here, we did this. After the Shakespeare Reading Company, the tutors came over and we had a dance. We liked that, she said. Or, whatever it might be. In the later letters, she writes a lot more about death and dying and illness for obvious reasons. These are topics that she's having to deal with on really almost a daily basis. Love is a topic of the letters increasingly as she gets older. I think that she understands love across a whole spectrum, as we all do, right? Although we sometimes forget about that and think love is only romantic. But no, you love your family, you love your friends, you love a partner, you love your parents, and so on. And all of these kinds of love are very vibrant in the letters, and increasingly so, I would say, after the starting the 1870s and then for the next 16 years of her life. You tell me.
Well, along those lines, what is your greatest hope for this collection and what it will contribute to the exciting world of Dickinson contemporary scholarship?
I have to say that the more I work on Dickinson, the more I discover about what we don't know yet, or what scholars have not yet really thought about or worked on. And so a couple of the things I would love to see people work on now are, one, her relationship with the Norcross cousins. I think that this is just so underrated as a part of her emotional, but also intellectual and cultural life. So that's just a huge topic that has barely been addressed. They got a bad rap for a long time. And, they really need to be recuperated and looked at again. Similarly, I think that Dickinson's relationship with Elizabeth Holland really could be, far more deeply and clearly understood. So Elizabeth Holland is a woman to whom she was writing almost as long as Susan, right? So she met Elizabeth just a few years later, went to Springfield to visit her. Elizabeth had eye problems like Dickinson. Dickinson writes hilariously about things she hears in church or people on their way to church to Elizabeth in ways she doesn't write to anybody else, really. So, how is it that Dickinson is able to share with Elizabeth a kind of partly ironic, partly sorrowful, partly joyous take on religion and church and faith, and so on. Anyway, so I think that, relationships with individuals, is a topic that really needs to be addressed. The EDIS meeting that will be here in Amherst in July is focusing in part on the letters, and I've been asked to say some words about Dickinson and her neighbors. And I think a book should be written on that topic. So I will just barely skim the surface of what can be said about Dickinson's relationship with her neighbors. I think she was seeing far more people than has been assumed. When you read those late letters and you see how many thank yous she's sending to people who have sent supper or bread or cake or eggs or whatever, and how many people she's sending food to, or flowers or whatever it might be, honey, and then you know that this is a very these are very interactive relationships. So even if she's not actually seeing these people very often, she is in touch with them in ways that suggest ongoing communication. So what I deeply feel from these letters, and I hope that others also are persuaded of this, is that Dickinson was not attempting to isolate herself. She was constantly reaching out to people. She was just doing it in a non-conventional way, right? She wasn't doing it by heading out the front door. She was doing it through letter writing and circulation of gifts.
The EDIS that Chris is referencing is the Emily Dickinson International Society. And if you just can't get enough of this wonderful editor here, you can come back in July and sign up for that annual meeting and hear more from Chris. But we have more to hear from you now because we want to turn it over to you all for your questions.
Yes, I'm eager to hear your questions.
So we're going to run a microphone over to the first person who raises their hand in this room.
This is connected to what you were just talking about, that subject of individuals. And I'm wondering, did you tabulate all of the letters from individuals? Is that in an appendix or something?
Yes. So there are several appendixes to the volume, and one of them is called Dickinson's Correspondence and Others, and it gives biographical sketches of all the people she writes to, and many of the people she mentions, but for whom there is no extant correspondence. And for each person, there is a list of every letter that she sent to that person by year, right? So 1861, 1862, 1879. Oh, that's interesting. My guess is there were some other letters in between that weren't saved or whatever it might have been. Yeah, so there is that list by letter number, so they're easy to find in the volume. Oh, I should also say there is also an index of all of the letters that are extant that were written to Dickinson. And they are included in the volume, but the index makes it easy to find them by page number. Whereas before, Johnson included some of them, but he included them as notes to other letters. And so it was sort of hit and miss to find them. But, now you can just easily see, okay, 7 letters from Helen Hunt Jackson. This is where they are, and so on.
This question comes from someone in the Zoom space. Shauna is so grateful that Dickinson's and other letters could still be discovered. Could you speak to why burning letters and correspondence upon death was practiced?
Yes. Okay. So this is actually a fascinating topic. In the 19th century, it was evidently conventional as a sign of respect and out of respect for privacy of communication to destroy letters that had been sent to you. So at Dickinson's death, people would destroy the letters that she had sent them. Or in some cases, rather than destroying the letters, people returned the letters to the sender, again, as a sign of respect for privacy. This is why Lavinia also destroyed all the letters that Dickinson had received after her death. So it's hugely fortunate that some letters to Dickinson remain. Many of them, of the handful, were kept because Dickinson wrote on the other side. She drafted poems or, used them for some other kind of writing. So Maggie Mayer wrote a letter to her and she uses the other side to draft a poem, right? So, but that means that we have that letter from Maggie Mayer or whoever it would have been. So that's not really an explanation, but it's, as much as I know, there are people, Jay Leda in The Years and Hours of Emily Dickinson quotes several people who reported to him that their family had received 75 poems or, over 100 letters from Dickinson and destroyed them.
Do we have some other questions from this room?
God, I hate microphones. So Open Me Carefully by Martha L. Smith, of course, came out in 1988, and it collects the letters between Emily and Susan. Of course, a little outdated now, even though there is an updated edition. Was there anything that you found in those letters in your research that stands out to you as unique, or any discoveries that were found that could basically update from Martha L. Smith's edition? If that question makes any sense.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. I think that Martha L. Smith and Ellen Louise Hart, the co-editors of that edition, did an extremely careful job. And they worked from manuscripts just as we did. We found no new letters to Susan, no new poems written and sent to Susan. And for people with a specific interest just in that relationship, Open Me Carefully, I think still remains extremely useful. We had a anonymous reviewer for our letters volume who was very familiar with Open Me Carefully and who commented in her reviewer report that it really changed her sense of, and she didn't explain, I say he, they did not explain how, but said it really changed their sense of the Susan Dickinson relationship to see those letters interspersed among Dickinson's letters to everyone else she was writing. And I think that this is true with any correspondence. If you read only the letters to Elizabeth Holland, you would have a very different sense potentially of the intimacy of that relationship than if you read those letters interspersed among those to all of Dickinson's other friends and family. So no, I don't think that there's anything new that we would add to Open Me Carefully, but we feel that the work of our edition performs a different kind of service. So does that help? Thank you.
We have a couple people in the Zoom room who are really wondering about, do you have any expectation that hopefully a great ways off, more letters might appear?
Well, okay. So Martha Ackman, who published a wonderful volume on Dickinson, I don't know, 5 years ago now, These Fevered Days, wrote a biographical sketch on Dickinson for the first Emily Dickinson handbook. And what she attempted to do at that time was to figure out whether there were any stones unturned that would result in the discovery of a cache of Dickinson letters, right? So not just maybe a single letter here or there, but were there any correspondents for whom we would find a bundle of letters or something? And she concluded pretty much no. All those stones had been turned over, and what was to be found had been found. And that's been that's I would say not entirely true in our experience, but the things that Donald and I discovered that had never before been published were for the most part very short, and they were isolated. So I don't know, a month, maybe a week before we were supposed to turn the final pages into Harvard, we learned about a letter that Dickinson had apparently written to a neighbor in Amherst on some occasion having to do with a granddaughter. I'm sorry, I'm not thinking of the details right away. But the person who discovered this letter among her family papers also had it laminated, which meant that there was no way for us to check authenticity of paper or ink or anything else. And so we were sort of battling about whether to include it or not, because we couldn't be sure it was an authentic letter. And finally we decided to include it and say, provenance unclear, because we don't know. And it seemed reasonable given other kinds of notes that she wrote and, other notes to this neighbor and the kind of relationship she had with their extended family. But my guess is the very most that we will find now are relatively isolated letters. She is so famous that if you found anything, you would turn it over. I also work on the poet Marianne Moore, and there was a really extraordinary case, maybe 25 years ago, where several manuscripts were stolen from the Rosenbach Museum and Library that houses the vast bulk of her correspondence. And eventually, as far as we know, almost all of those manuscripts were recovered by serendipity, for the most part, in a West Virginia, kind of junk store. But there we knew that there'd been a theft. We knew that a lot of manuscripts were missing. With Dickinson, as far as we know, the people who received letters from her either destroyed them or turned them over to Todd, or transcribed them like Joseph Lyman or like the Norcrosses, or, bit by bit, they've come to light.
Sorry, I'm not over the laminating. Let's see, are there other questions from this room?
Hi, I can't wait to read the book. I was wondering if you have a favorite of Emily's letters that you could share with us.
Oh, I was hoping you wouldn't ask that. All right. I guess I would say that, at least at the moment, my favorite letter is that one that I quoted, that she sent to Sarah Tuckerman, that includes the phrase, "Morning without you is a dwindled dawn." Isn't that incredible? I mean, imagine getting that. It suggests such intimacy. So yeah, I think that's pretty special. I saw it.
In terms of the erasures that you were looking at, do you feel that the ones that were found in Austen's possession were caught, like it was him who did it out of an emotionally charged thing, or Emily doing it to be private?
Okay, so it seems quite certain that Emily herself did not erase anything, right? Okay, so the two primary candidates for erasure are Mabel Loomis Todd, who was editing the letters and who was Austen's lover and had been for over a decade by the time she was editing the letters, or possibly Austen himself. My guess would be Mabel Loomis Todd. But the initial, or some of the early scholarship on these erasures assumed that Sue's name was being erased in order to disguise the intimacy of Emily's and Susan's relationship. Whereas it seems to me, when you look at what's being erased and the context of those letters, what's being disguised is how early Austen and Sue were involved, or Mabel Loomis Todd just wanted to get rid of all signs of Susan's presence. So, for example, one of the passages that she crosses out from the Norcross transcripts is about Austen, and it's not altogether complimentary, and it contains a reference to presumably Sue, S, period, and that passage is both crossed out and the S is crossed out 3 times and then he written over it. It's like, but she's not even printing it, right? So did she first cross out the S? And anyway, my guess is this was Mabel Loomis Todd, and it was hostility towards Susan, and that really didn't have to do with particular relationships. But that's total speculation. Again, read those letters. Tell me what you think.
Someone on Zoom is wondering, Chris, about have you, working on this edition, have you had further thoughts about the master letters and potential recipients of those?
No. That's the simple answer. No. Those are exquisite documents. And there is no one who received extant correspondence during the years that Dickinson wrote those 3 letters who could have been, it seems to me, the recipient of that material. So is there somebody we didn't know about? Or Marta Werner now has a new book out called Writing in Time, and it's a new look at the master letters. It was published here by the, yes, there we go. Martin is holding it up. It was published by the Amherst College Press. Really lovely book, and she makes, I think, a very persuasive case that Dickinson is writing not just those 3 master letters, but a number of what she calls master documents. So poems that use a similar kind of erotic or romantic language, or that also use the word master or so on, within that period of time in the late 1850s, early 1860s, and that Dickinson is using this figure as a way to as part of the innovative, creative process that she's engaged in. So I don't want to say a muse. That's not the kind of language that Marta uses, or that I would either. But a figure who that is useful to Dickinson as an imagined correspondent or addressee to whom she can write in the process of her own creativity.
Awake, he muses 9.
Yes.
I think we have time for one more question from this audience and one more from Zoom. Is there one left in this room?
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask about this natural phenomenon you mentioned. What particular sources did you use to define what kind of phenomenon she was referring to? And to what level we can trust those sources like the scientific sources? And because when I'm thinking about Dickinson, is that part of her work is just also to allow your imagination to create a new story. And the second question is that what was the most bizarre or most unexpected area of knowledge you needed to become familiar with during work on the edition? Thank you.
Oh, that second question. That's a great one. Oh, but I'll answer the first one first because I can. So as I said, Donald Mitchell was responsible for almost all of the dating work, but I was responsible for dating by nature, right? So, and in part, this was possible for me because I grew up in and live in North America. Buffalo has a climate very similar to Amherst and Western Massachusetts. So I know these flora and fauna and something about the way the seasons turn, and that it's not at all exceptional for there to be snow in April or a few sunny days in February, and so on and so on. So partly it was just my knowledge. We also spent a lot of time, or I spent a lot of time on websites, gardening websites. What's happening with this particular flower in Western Massachusetts? And there are even sites where you can say, in the 19th century, when would robins have first appeared in Western Massachusetts, or whatever it would be? So, the internet was actually extremely useful for thinking about some of those things. Again, we would never rely exclusively on the internet, but this could help us, put the date of a letter within a kind of range, right? Okay, the most bizarre kind of knowledge we needed to know. I don't know. It seems there are so many. Donald was just the great fact man, and he came up with information. It's like I would never have dreamed that it was out there, let alone that someone could find it, let alone that it would be relevant. And we actually had quite a few arguments about the extent to which things that he found should go into the notes, because he wanted everything that he found to go into the annotation, and I kept saying, no, we have a word limit. We want information in the indexes. We can't make the notes longer than some of the letters, and so on and so on. Anyway, he just read voraciously about where people were from, where people were educated, what they were doing. Well, here's something that came as a total shock. And again, it was information we learned just as we were sending the volume finished to the press. Sarah Tuckerman, who I've mentioned a few times, the first extant letter to Tuckerman is in something like 1872. We didn't realize until really late in the game that she had moved to Amherst in 1855, and there is clear evidence from letters within the Tuckerman family. So from Sarah Eliza to her two sisters about visits from Lavinia and Emily to Sarah Tuckerman and her husband soon after they arrived, exchange of flowers, continuing visits, notes that we know were sent. And it's clear that Tuckerman was not keeping those early notes. She didn't start keeping the notes until later. And it must have been at that point that she realized, oh, this is an important person. I should be saving this correspondence. Anyway, it's not a great answer, but best I could do.
So I think this will be our last question, and it's a great one. It comes from someone on Zoom who asks, Dr. Miller, do you believe that Dickinson wrote with her future archive in mind?
Yes, I do. I sincerely believe that Dickinson would never have guessed that she would have a worldwide audience, I think, but she knew that she was an important poet, and she was saving her poems. Think of those fascicles because she wanted them to be read. She didn't want to publish in her lifetime. She didn't want to deal with any of that stuff, but she was saving them because she wanted them to be read. And I think she knew that they would be. Did she know the letters would be read or collected? Hard to say, because on the one hand, there was a convention of destroying letters that were sent. On the other hand, there was a very active publication of important people's letters. She read letters. She read people's letters that had been published. And so somewhere in her mind, she must have known that there was at least the possibility, especially the letters to Higginson, or to people like Helen Hunt Jackson, or to Thomas Niles. I think she knew that there was a good chance those letters would be saved and circulated beyond, her manuscript. So.
Well, Dr. Cristanne Miller, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you to Donald Mitchell as well, co-editor of this incredible new resource for us. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to Martin Garner and Frost Library and our partners at Harvard University Press. And there are books for sale back there, and Chris will be signing. So I hope you will avail yourselves, stay and chit chat, eat cookies. And to learn more about our programs, you at home can visit Emily Dickinson Museum.org, which we will put in the chat. Thank you, everybody, for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.